Procrastination is not a character flaw. It is not a sign of laziness. And it is definitely not a failure of time management. In fact, evolutionary psychology suggests it might actually be a deeply ingrained survival tactic, a fast life history strategy designed to protect us in unpredictable environments.
Right, it completely flips the script on how we view our own behavior. Because, we spend so much time beating ourselves up.
So much guilt.
Exactly, feeling completely guilty, totally unaware of the ancient biological programming running quietly in the background, just dictating our choices.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a hard look at your to-do list, and we're on a mission to fundamentally rewrite everything you thought you knew about why you avoid it, and more importantly, how you can finally stop. We are pulling from a fascinating stack of sources today. We've got neuroscientific research, psychological theories, and Neil Fiore's strategic program, The Now Habit.
And our goal here isn't to hand you another, generic, guilt-inducing lecture on time management.
Please, no more of those.
Right. We are going to dismantle the shame you feel around delaying tasks by actually looking under the hood at the mechanics of what is happening in your mind and body.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how to beat procrastination, we first have to understand the biological hardware running the program. Like, why would evolution possibly install a feature that makes me put off doing my taxes until midnight the day before they are due?
Well, what's fascinating here is that evolutionary concept you just mentioned in the hook, the fast life history strategy.
Right, the survival tactic.
Exactly. To understand this, we need to take a trip back in time. Imagine our ancestors living in a highly chaotic, uncontrollable, and dangerous environment.
Okay, tracking.
In that world, long-term effort is a massive gamble. It might not actually yield future rewards at all.
Because you might not be around to see them.
Precisely. If you don't know if you will survive the week, saving your resources or your physical energy for a payoff 5 years down the road is actually a terrible maladaptive strategy.
Right, it's the classic scenario. You don't save the nutrient-dense berries for the winter if there is a very real chance a saber-toothed tiger is going to eat you outside your cave today. You eat the berries now.
Exactly that. In chaotic environments, it is biologically much safer to seek immediate hedonic rewards and just conserve your energy.
Wow.
Yeah, your brain learned over millions of years that present survival completely overrides future planning.
So when you procrastinate today, part of that is your brain relying on an ancient strategy to hedge against an unpredictable future.
You got it. You are choosing the immediate guaranteed reward, like the dopamine hit of scrolling on your phone, over the heavy, energetic exertion of a future abstract enhancement, like writing a quarterly report.
So if I'm choosing cleaning my baseboards over opening a massive spreadsheet, my brain isn't necessarily broken. It's just prioritizing short-term mood repair and immediate visual reward over long-term logic. Is that essentially the limbic system hijacking the process?
That is precisely what's happening. You are experiencing a literal neural war inside your skull. It is a biological battle between two very different competing brain systems.
The old and the new, right?
Yeah, on one side you have the limbic system. This is the evolutionarily older area of the brain. It deals with emotion, threat detection, and immediate reward. When it feels discomfort, it demands immediate comfort and mood repair.
And the other side?
On the other side, you have the prefrontal cortex. That's the newer, more sophisticated area responsible for long-term planning, executive function, and self-control.
So when we procrastinate, it's basically like a panicked toddler, the limbic system, grabbing the steering wheel of a car because it's scared of the road ahead, while the rational adult, the prefrontal cortex, is asleep in the back seat.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. And neuroscientists have actually mapped this toddler taking the wheel moment by looking at specific brain networks.
Wait, they can actually see this happening?
Yes, they can. When you face a daunting task, something called the default mode network, or DMN, fires up. The DMN is strongly linked to mind wandering, self-reflection, and rumination.
The overthinking network.
Exactly. In people who chronically procrastinate, this network becomes incredibly overactive when they feel overwhelmed. It acts like static on a radio, completely drowning out the executive emotional network, which is the part of your brain trying to handle planning and impulse control.
But wait, let me push back on this for a second. If this is all just ancient wiring, fighting brain networks, and a panicked toddler at the wheel, does that mean we're just helpless slaves to our biology? Like, the sources even mentioned genetics. They talked about variations in the tyrosine hydroxylase gene. How does that fit in? If my genetics say I'm going to procrastinate, am I just doomed?
This raises an important question about biological determinism, But no, you are not doomed. Let's look at what that tyrosine hydroxylase gene actually does. It regulates dopamine synthesis. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that drives us toward rewards. For people with certain variations of this gene, their dopamine signaling makes immediate gratification significantly more tempting.
Oh, so for those people, the toddler is just biologically louder?
Precisely. Their brain gets a much stronger, more intoxicating signal from a short-term distraction. When they look at their phone, their brain screams, "Survival resource!" much louder than someone without that genetic variation.
Wow.
So biology is not destiny, but it absolutely dictates the starting line. Having that specific gene variation means the prefrontal cortex, that rational adult in the back seat, has to fight a lot harder to wake up and take the wheel. It requires more deliberate, conscious effort to override the biological urge to scroll.
Okay, so if the prefrontal cortex is asleep or struggling to fight off the limbic system, how does the brain actually decide when the threat of a deadline outweighs the comfort of doing nothing? Because eventually, the panic sets in. The taxes do get filed, the paper does get written. It turns out the brain is running a subconscious calculus to figure out exactly when to start panicking.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to talk about the cognitive mathematics of task avoidance, specifically temporal motivation theory, or TMT.
TMT. Okay, break that down for us.
This was developed by researcher Piers Steele, and it actually gives us a mathematical formula for procrastination. It states that your motivation equals expectancy multiplied by value. That is the top half of the equation.
Got it.
Then you divide that by impulsiveness multiplied by delay. That's the bottom half.
Okay, let's break that math down in an audio show so we don't lose anyone.
Right.
Because visualizing a fraction without a whiteboard is tough. Let's start with the top half, the numerator. This is basically your reward, right?
Yes, exactly.
So expectancy is your confidence that you can actually succeed at the task. Value is how genuinely rewarding or enjoyable the task is.
Correct. The top half is all about the positive pull of the task. If a task is incredibly boring, meaning it has low value, or you honestly don't think you have the skills to do it well, which is low expectancy, your motivation drops significantly.
And then on the bottom half of the fraction, the denominator, we have the costs.
Yeah.
Impulsiveness is your biological sensitivity to distraction, how loud that toddler is. And delay is how far away the deadline is.
Right. So if the deadline is 3 months away, which is a massive delay, and you have a high sensitivity to your phone pinging high impulsiveness, the bottom number of that fraction becomes huge.
And dividing by a huge number means
When you divide your reward by a massive cost, your motivation absolutely plummets to near zero.
the sources have this incredibly relatable example to illustrate this subconscious math, and I want to spend some time on it. Let's call him Thomas.
Poor Thomas.
Right. Thomas is a college student. On September 15th, he gets assigned a massive, highly important essay that is due on December 15th. Every day, Thomas has two choices: study or socialize.
And his brain is running that TMT formula for both options simultaneously.
Exactly. Socializing has an immediate, high present utility. The delay is zero. The value is high because it's fun right now, so his brain mathematically values it heavily.
While the essay is the exact opposite.
Writing the essay has a massive delay attached to its reward. 3 whole months. So according to the formula, Thomas's brain looks at the essay in September, October, and November and says, not worth the energy.
It's just too far away to care.
Yep. It only ranks writing the essay higher than socializing on December 3rd. He mathematically leaves himself just 12 days of frantic, panic-driven effort.
And we have to ask why that switch in motivational rank happens on December 3rd. It happens because the delay variable in the denominator finally shrinks enough to make the formula tip.
The threat gets real.
The impending doom of the deadline acts as a massive threat, which artificially inflates the value of the task. The fear of failing the class finally outweighs the joy of socializing.
But what I want to know is, why does the expectancy part of the equation, our confidence in success, drop so low for some people? Because we see incredibly smart, capable, highly successful people procrastinate all the time.
We really do.
It's not that they don't have the skills, so why does their brain calculate that they might fail?
That is where Louis Chen's brilliant research on perfectionism comes into play. We have this societal myth that perfectionists are highly productive high achievers.
Right, the type A personality.
But the research shows that a specific type of perfectionism is actually a massive driver of severe procrastination. Chen's research discusses a phenomenon called the pole vaulter syndrome.
The pole vaulter syndrome. I love this visual, but walk us through exactly how it sabotages the brain.
Imagine a track and field pole vaulter. Every single time they successfully clear the bar, what happens next?
The officials raise the bar higher.
Exactly. For a perfectionist, life feels exactly like this. Every time they succeed at a project, their own internal expectations and the perceived expectations of their boss or peers get raised higher and higher. They are never allowed to just clear the same height. This creates a constant looming fear of failure.
So eventually the bar is set so unrealistically high, maybe they're expected to write a flawless, award-winning report on the first draft, that the vaulter just looks at the bar, gets physically terrified, and refuses to pick up the pole at all.
That is exactly the mechanism. Chen distinguishes between two types of perfectionism here. Adaptive perfectionism is actually quite helpful.
Oh, okay, so there's a good kind.
Yeah, it involves realistic goal setting, a tolerance for small mistakes, and positive striving. That type reduces procrastination. But maladaptive perfectionism completely paralyzes the individual.
Because the standards are impossible.
They are so deeply terrified that their work won't meet these impossibly high self-imposed standards that the mere thought of starting the task becomes heavily aversive.
Because starting the task means facing the possibility that you aren't perfect.
Yes, starting triggers severe performance anxiety. So going back to our math formula, the expectancy variable, the belief that they can successfully complete the task to their impossible standards plummets to zero. And when expectancy is zero, motivation is zero.
Which brings us to a massive realization. If the math tells us when we delay, the psychology tells us what that calculation actually feels like in the body. And this was a huge aha moment for me in the sources.
Oh, absolutely.
Procrastination is not about avoiding work. It is about avoiding negative emotions.
That is the core insight of Neil Fiore's work in The Now Habit. When you are faced with a daunting task, especially if you have that maladaptive perfectionism, your brain anticipates boredom, frustration, or most commonly, severe anxiety.
It's an emotional shield.
Procrastination is essentially an emotion-focused coping strategy. It is a defense mechanism. By putting the task off, you immediately relieve the negative emotion. You feel better instantly.
It's the toddler screaming in the grocery store, and you hand them a candy bar just to make the crying stop. You aren't solving the root problem, you were just buying momentary peace.
That is a great comparison.
And there's this incredible, agonizing, real-life case study in the text about a woman named Carolyn that perfectly illustrates this.
Oh man, Carolyn's story is something that almost everyone can relate to.
She had this specific, tedious administrative task she had to do for work, and she dreaded it. She put it off for weeks. Let's really sit with what those weeks felt like. Every morning, she woke up with a knot in her stomach.
Just carrying it around everywhere.
Exactly. She carried the guilt of this unfinished task to every meeting, to dinner with her family, to bed at night. She let the anxiety build and compound, letting it cast a dark shadow over her entire month. But when the deadline finally forced her hand and she sat down to actually do the work, the actual task only took 9.5 minutes.
9.5 minutes of actual execution weighed against weeks of profound psychological torment.
It perfectly highlights the great illusion of procrastination. Starting is often the only hard part. The anticipation of the pain is infinitely worse than the pain itself.
But there is a very dark side to this emotion-focused coping mechanism, and it has to do with the stress feedback loop in our biology.
Okay, break it down.
Well, when you procrastinate, you get that temporary emotional relief. You feel good for an hour. But as the deadline creeps closer and the math formula starts tipping, what happens? Your stress levels absolutely skyrocket.
Because the panic sets in.
Exactly. Your body releases a massive flood of cortisol, which is our primary stress hormone.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because that cortisol doesn't just make your heart race and your palms sweat. It fundamentally alters how your brain functions, doesn't it?
It does. Chronically high cortisol levels literally impair the prefrontal cortex.
Wait, really?
Yes, the exact part of the brain you desperately need for executive function, focus, and self-control is neurologically weakened by the stress hormone.
So chronic stress essentially acts like rust on the prefrontal cortex.
Yes, exactly.
The more we procrastinate to avoid anxiety, the more the resulting stress rusts and eats away at our actual biological braking system. By procrastinating, we are chemically guaranteeing that we will have less self-control the next time we face a difficult task.
That isn't a perfect metaphor.
Yeah.
You are biologically reinforcing the habit. You are conditioning your brain to seek immediate escape the next time anxiety hits, because your prefrontal cortex is too rusted and weakened by previous stress cycles to fight back against the limbic system.
Oh, the irony is just brutal. In our desperate attempt to avoid the stress of a task, we chemically alter our own brains to experience more stress and have worse self-control.
It's a vicious cycle.
Which is exactly why traditional time management advice is so completely useless for chronic procrastinators.
It completely misses the biological reality of the problem.
Right, because traditional advice is always, just force yourself to do it, make a stricter schedule, be more disciplined, set an alarm for 5 a.m.
Which just makes things worse.
Exactly, because if procrastination is fundamentally an anxiety response, faced discipline and rigid schedules just trigger more anxiety, which leads to another flood of cortisol and another limbic system hijack.
Yep.
But let me push back here. If I don't use discipline and I don't schedule my work, my fear is I'll just sit on the couch all week watching television. How do we trick our brains out of this without completely dropping the ball on our responsibilities?
We have to reverse engineer the process.
Mm-hmm.
We have to give the brain the safety and the reward it craves first.
Okay.
And this is where Fiore introduces a completely counterintuitive solution. He calls it the unschedule.
The unschedule, it sounds entirely backwards to me. Explain the mechanics of how this doesn't just result in zero work getting done.
The primary principle of the unschedule is that you absolutely do not schedule your work projects in advance.
Wait, really? Not at all.
Not at all. Instead, you schedule your leisure, your meals, your sleep, your socializing, your workouts, and your hobbies first. You literally fill in your calendar blocks with all the non-work activities that make up a healthy, balanced, enjoyable life.
So you are officially guaranteeing your toddler brain that it is going to get to have fun,
Exactly.
but you are also taking away the illusion of time. Like, when I think about a project, I imagine I have a vast, endless 24 hours to suffer through it.
And the unschedule shatters that illusion. When you see your week mapped out with 8 hours of sleep, commuting, cooking dinner, calling your parents, and going to the gym, you look at the white space left over and suddenly realize you actually only have a few scattered hours available for focused work.
Which completely changes your perspective.
It does. It creates a healthy, realistic sense of urgency, but without the paralyzing, cortisol-spiking dread a strict work schedule.
But if I don't schedule the work block, when do I actually do the work?
Here is the brilliant mechanical rule of the unschedule. You treat it like a retroactive time clock. You only get to punch in and record work on your calendar after you have completed 30 minutes of uninterrupted work on your project. You color it in after the fact to claim credit.
Okay, I want to understand the ELI5 I'm 5 mechanism behind this. Why 30 minutes? How does that specific time frame slip past our biological defense mechanisms?
It comes down to how your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, categorizes danger.
Right.
If you tell yourself, I'm going to sit down and finish this massive 10-hour project today, your amygdala scans that intention, categorizes it as a massive energetic threat, and triggers the fight-or-flight-freeze response.
A panic sets in.
Cortisol floods your system, and you find yourself cleaning the baseboards.
The toddler screams and grabs the wheel.
Right. But if you tell yourself, I am not finishing this project, I am only committing to 30 minutes of work, and then I can stop, the amygdala scans that intention and categorizes it as non-threatening.
Because it's so small.
Exactly. 30 minutes is a highly manageable amount of energy expenditure. It doesn't trigger the freeze response, the limbic system stays calm, the prefrontal cortex stays engaged, and you are able to start.
And once you start, the physics of momentum take over. As we saw with Carolyn, starting is the only hard part.
It's so much easier to keep going for an hour once you've tricked your brain into taking the first step.
But the unscheduled relies heavily on another concept that I think is incredibly vital, something Fiore calls guilt-free play.
This requires a massive psychological paradigm shift. Most chronic procrastinators view play, rest, or hobbies as a guilty distraction.
Oh, totally.
You know this feeling intimately. You're watching a movie with your family or playing a video game, but the entire time you have a heavy knot in your stomach because you feel like you should be working. You aren't actually resting.
It's the absolute worst of both worlds. You aren't getting any work done, but you also aren't enjoying your rest. You are just marinating in low-level cortisol.
Exactly. But Fiore points out that peak performers, people who get massive amounts of work done without burning out, do the exact opposite. They actively prioritize guilt-free play. They do not view work as a deprivation of their life.
There's a really vivid example in the text about a Saturday morning that brings this to life. Imagine you have a massive overdue report.
We've all been there.
The traditional procrastinator wakes up on Saturday, sits at their desk at 9 a.m., and agonizes over the blank page. They feel miserable, they check their phone, they stare out the window. By noon, they've gotten nothing done, they feel exhausted from the mental friction, and they've ruined their weekend.
It's exhausting.
But the peak performer who utilizes guilt-free play, they handle it completely differently.
Yeah, the peak performer wakes up on Saturday and goes to play their favorite sport or goes for a hike for 2 solid hours.
And initially, if you try this, you might feel a pang of panic, like, I shouldn't be hiking, I have a report. But as you hike, what happens biologically? Your body releases endorphins, the default mode network quiets down, your mind actually clears.
And by the time you sit down at your desk at 1 p.m., you are physically and mentally refreshed. You don't feel like your work is depriving you of your weekend because you already took your weekend.
The toddler has been taken to the park.
Right, you've satisfied the limbic system's need for reward and stimulation. So now, the prefrontal cortex is free to lock in and focus without interference. The play actually fuels your cognitive capacity for the work.
To make this work, though, the sources note there is a crucial cognitive behavioral shift required. You have to actively change your internal language. Procrastinators naturally use victim language.
That's a huge point.
They say things to themselves like, I have to finish this massive project, and I have to do it perfectly, and I have no time to see my friends until it's done. That language creates a deep sense of entrapment and threat.
Which again spikes the anxiety and the cortisol, rusting the prefrontal cortex.
Exactly. So you must consciously shift to empowering language. You have to speak to yourself using the language of a producer. Instead of saying, I have to finish, you say, I choose to start.
It's a subtle change, but so powerful.
You move from a state of obligation to a state of autonomy. I choose to start on one small step for just 30 minutes, with plenty of time guaranteed for guilt-free play later.
I choose to start. It shrinks the monster in the closet down to a manageable size. It removes the expectation of perfection, and it focuses entirely on the mechanism of momentum.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? If we synthesize everything we've pulled apart today, the ultimate takeaway is this: you are not lazy.
No, you're really not.
The societal narrative that you just lack willpower or moral fiber is a complete myth. Your brain is an incredibly complex machine trying to balance millions of years of evolutionary survival instincts, the genetic baseline of your dopamine receptors, and the very real, very paralyzing modern anxiety of perfectionism. You are fighting a biological and psychological war every single time you open a blank document.
Which is why the absolute best thing you can do for your productivity and your mental health is to stop punishing yourself with guilt. You have to start treating your time and yourself with far more compassion.
Absolutely.
Use tools like the unschedule to guarantee time for the things that make you human. By prioritizing your rest, your meals, and your play, you are biologically starving your anxiety of its power over you.
You essentially have to trick the toddler by giving it the toy first, ensuring it feels safe and happy so the adult can drive the car in peace.
That is the perfect way to encapsulate the entire strategy.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today, from ancient survival strategies and dopamine synthesis to the cognitive mathematics of delay and the life-changing biological magic of the unschedule. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to chew on as you go about the rest of your day.
Okay, let's hear it.
If human biology is evolutionarily wired to resist massive, ambiguous, long-term projects, and if our brains fundamentally require immediate rewards, autonomy, and guilt-free play just to maintain the executive function necessary to focus, how completely misaligned is the modern 9-to-5 corporate structure? Does the entire concept of the rigid 40-hour work week, where we are expected to maintain steady output regardless of our biological rhythms, need to be completely burned down and redesigned to actually fit human neurobiology?
That is a systemic contradiction that we are all paying the price for. It's a question well worth exploring.
Until next time, go schedule some guilt-free play on your calendar right now. You've earned it.